In this in-depth and critical analysis, we examine the failures and flaws of India's foreign policy, focusing on its undefined, unclear, and often contradictory stance in global geopolitics. From its complex relationships with major powers like Russia, China, and the USA, to its role in organizations such as BRICS, SEO, and Quad, India's foreign policy remains a subject of debate. Has India's adherence to non-alignment left it without a clear strategic direction? Are its relationships with both the East and the West weakening its position as a global leader? In this video, we take a deep dive into that. India's strategic ambiguity between aligning with the East, Russia, China, BRICS, SEO, or the West, Quad, NATO, USA, EU. The India-China relationship, marked by tensions and military confrontations. The India-USA relationship, a promising partnership or a missed opportunity. The impact of domestic politics on India's foreign policy decisions is, well, quite significant. You see, domestic political dynamics often shape the priorities and actions on the international stage. Leaders need to balance internal pressures with external strategies, making it a complex interplay. For instance, public opinion and electoral considerations can sometimes drive foreign policy choices, reflecting the intricate connection between the home front and global engagements. Why India's regional relationships with neighbors like Pakistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka remain strained. Is India's participation in multilateral organizations like BRICS and SEO an opportunity or a hindrance? Criticism of India's reactive approach to global challenges and its failure to lead in global governance. This comprehensive video provides a strong anti-India foreign policy perspective, challenging the strategic foresight of its current trajectory and questioning where India really stands in the evolving global order. Join the conversation. Share your thoughts on India's foreign policy failures and what the future holds. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more insightful videos on global politics and international relations. Let's start. The foreign policy of any nation is a reflection of its domestic priorities, geopolitical constraints, historical context, and the global environment. India's foreign policy, often seen as a complex balancing act between the East and the West, has been criticized for its undefined, unclear, and sometimes contradictory stances. This essay seeks to analyze in depth the perceived failures and flaws in India's foreign policy, particularly in light of its interactions with major global powers such as Russia, China, the United States, and its involvement in multilateral platforms like BRICS, SEO, Quad, and its broader relationship with NATO and the European Union. Since its independence in 1947, India's foreign policy has been shaped by its colonial experience, economic underdevelopment, and geopolitical environment. India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, is often credited with laying the foundation of its foreign policy with an emphasis on non-alignment. The non-aligned movement aimed to keep India neutral during the Cold War, as it refused to ally with either the Soviet Union or the United States. Nehru's vision of an independent, sovereign, and non-aligned India, though noble in theory, laid the groundwork for some of the issues that India faces today, particularly the lack of a clear long-term strategic alignment. One of the main critiques of India's foreign policy is its lack of a well-defined and consistent approach. While many countries operate with a clear foreign policy direction, India has often been criticized for adopting a reactive rather than proactive stance. This has led to perceptions of inconsistency, as India has attempted to straddle both the Eastern and Western blocs without fully committing to either. India's indecisiveness on whether to align more closely with the West or the East has been one of its biggest flaws. For instance, India has historically maintained strong ties with Russia, owing to Cold War-era collaborations, arms purchases, and a long-standing strategic partnership. At the same time, India has deepened its relations with the United States and its allies through forums like Quad, particularly in response to China's rising assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific region. India's attempt to balance these relationships, however, has resulted in a foreign policy that is often unclear and contradictory. On one hand, it continues to purchase large amounts of defense equipment from Russia, even as it seeks to deepen security ties with the United States and other Western powers. This dual approach not only alienates potential allies, but also dilutes India's standing in global affairs. India's refusal to clearly define its position on major geopolitical issues, such as the Russia-Ukraine conflict, has further underscored the perceived haziness of its foreign policy. India's adherence to the principles of the non-aligned movement has become increasingly outdated in the post-Cold War era. As global dynamics have shifted from a bipolar to a multipolar world, non-alignment no longer serves India's interests as effectively as it once did. Critics argue that clinging to this outdated concept has prevented India from fully committing to meaningful partnerships that could enhance its global stature. For instance, India's reluctance to clearly align with the West has hindered its ability to fully benefit from security and economic partnerships with the United States, EU, and other Western allies. Simultaneously, its cautious approach to Russia and China has made it difficult to fully capitalize on potential economic and strategic opportunities within BRICS and the SCO. India's hesitance to fully commit to either bloc leaves it in a geopolitical limbo, weakening its position on the global stage. Historically, India and Russia shared a strong strategic relationship, with the USSR being a key supplier of military hardware and a reliable ally in international forums. This relationship was largely based on mutual interest during the Cold War, with India receiving crucial military support during its conflicts with China and Pakistan. However, in recent years, the India-Russia relationship has shown signs of strain. India's growing economic and defense ties with the West, particularly the United States, have raised concerns in Moscow. Additionally, Russia's deepening ties with China, particularly in the context of their shared opposition to the West, have complicated India's ability to maintain the same level of partnership with Russia. Russia's increasingly close ties with China, India's strategic rival, particularly on issues like the Indo-Pacific and border disputes, present a significant challenge to India's foreign policy. Critics argue that India's continued reliance on Russian military hardware in the face of these developments is not only short-sighted, but also a failure of its foreign policy establishment to anticipate and adapt to changing geopolitical realities. India's relationship with China has been fraught with tensions, particularly due to their disputed border and China's growing influence in South Asia and the Indian Ocean region. China's Belt and Road Initiative, which seeks to expand its influence through infrastructure projects in India's neighboring countries like Pakistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, has been viewed as a direct challenge to India's regional dominance. Despite these tensions, India has been reluctant to fully embrace a hardline stance against China. For example, India's engagement with China through platforms like BRICS and the SCO, despite the ongoing border tensions and skirmishes, has raised questions about the coherence of its foreign policy. Critics argue that India's willingness to engage with China in multilateral forums, while simultaneously participating in anti-China alliances like the Quad, reflects an inability to take a decisive stance. This balancing act, rather than positioning India as a global leader, is often seen as a sign of weakness. India's inability to effectively counter China's growing influence, both in the region and globally, has led to accusations that its foreign policy lacks a clear strategic vision. In recent years, India has sought to deepen its ties with the United States, largely as a counterbalance to China's growing influence. The US has recognized India as a key strategic partner in the Indo-Pacific region and has sought to bring India into a closer security and economic partnership, particularly through the Quad, which also includes Japan and Australia. However, despite these efforts, India's reluctance to fully embrace the US has been a major point of criticism. For instance, India's purchase of the Russian S-400 missile defense system in defiance of US sanctions has strained relations between the two countries. Critics argue that India's foreign policy establishment has failed to fully appreciate the importance of aligning more closely with the US and other Western powers, particularly in light of China's growing influence in the region. India's hesitance to fully embrace the West, despite the clear benefits in terms of security and economic development, is often cited as a major flaw in its foreign policy. This reluctance has prevented India from fully leveraging its strategic partnerships with the US, Japan, and other Western powers, leaving it in a weaker position to counter both China's and Russia's influence. India's involvement in BRICS, which includes Brazil, Russia, China, and South Africa, is often cited as an example of its attempt to balance relations between the East and West. While BRICS offers opportunities for economic and political cooperation, particularly in terms of counterbalancing Western-dominated institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, it also presents challenges. China's dominant role within BRICS, particularly in terms of its economic clout, has raised concerns about India's ability to assert its influence within the organization. Critics argue that India's involvement in BRICS, while beneficial in some respects, has prevented it from fully aligning with Western powers, particularly the US and the EU, which could offer more significant economic and security benefits. India's membership in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is dominated by China and Russia, is another example of its unclear foreign policy direction. While the SCO offers India opportunities for cooperation on issues like counterterrorism and regional security, its involvement in an organization so heavily influenced by China has raised questions about the coherence of its broader strategic objectives. Critics argue that India's membership in the SCO, despite its growing tensions with China, reflects a lack of strategic foresight. Rather than aligning more closely with like-minded democracies in the West, India's continued involvement in the SCO is seen as a misguided attempt to balance its relationships with both the East and the West. The Quad, which includes the US, Japan, Australia, and India, is often seen as a counterbalance to China's growing influence in the Indo-Pacific. While India's involvement in the Quad has been a positive development, critics argue that it has not fully leveraged the alliance to its advantage. India's reluctance to take a more assertive stance against China, particularly in terms of security cooperation with the US and other Quad members, is seen as a major flaw in its foreign policy. Critics argue that India's foreign policy establishment has failed to fully appreciate the importance of the Quad as a platform for countering China's influence, and has instead sought to maintain a cautious approach, which has undermined the alliance's potential. One of the most frequently leveled criticisms against India's foreign policy is its inherent strategic ambiguity. While this ambiguity might have been an asset during the Cold War, when India sought to maintain non-alignment in a bipolar world, it has become a significant liability in the present day. The global landscape has shifted dramatically with the rise of China, the increasing assertiveness of Russia, the growing influence of the US in Asia, and the resurgence of regional alliances. In this multipolar world, India's ambiguous foreign policy stance has failed to deliver clear strategic benefits. India's refusal to decisively align with any major bloc, whether it be the West, US, NATO, EU, Quad, or the East, Russia, China, BRICS, SCO, has limited its ability to build deep, long-term partnerships. This balancing act has resulted in a foreign policy that often appears reactive and opportunistic rather than coherent and strategic. Critics argue that this lack of clear strategic direction has left India vulnerable to being sidelined in key global negotiations such as trade agreements, climate change summits, and security discussions. Furthermore, India's inability to articulate a clear grand strategy has led to the perception that it is more focused on managing short-term crises rather than preparing for long-term geopolitical challenges. Another significant failure of India's foreign policy lies in its inability to build stable and cooperative relationships with its immediate neighbors. Despite its ambitions to be a regional power in South Asia, India has often struggled to maintain positive relations with countries in its own backyard, such as Pakistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. This failure is particularly evident when compared to China, which has been able to build strong economic and political ties with these same countries, often at India's expense. India's approach to Pakistan has been marked by deep mistrust, military tensions, and a failure to establish a long-term diplomatic framework. This has allowed external powers such as China and the US to exploit these tensions to their own advantage. India's relationship with Nepal has also deteriorated, with disputes over border issues and a perception in Kathmandu that India has often treated Nepal with condescension and disregard for its sovereignty. This has pushed Nepal closer to China, which has capitalized on India's missteps to expand its influence in the region through infrastructure investment and diplomatic outreach. Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, two other key neighbors, have similarly moved closer to China in recent years. Sri Lanka, for example, has been a significant recipient of Chinese investment through the Belt and Road Initiative, while Bangladesh has deepened its military and economic ties with China. India's inability to counter Chinese influence in its neighborhood is often cited as a major foreign policy failure, reflecting a lack of strategic foresight and diplomatic finesse. Perhaps the most glaring failure in India's foreign policy has been its handling of its relationship with China. Despite being natural rivals for influence in Asia, India has failed to adopt a consistent and coherent strategy for managing China's rise. India's engagement with China has often oscillated between cooperation in multilateral forums like BRICS and SQ and confrontation over border disputes, particularly in the Himalayan region. This inconsistent approach has led to an unstable relationship marked by mistrust and occasional military skirmishes, most notably the deadly clashes in the Galwan Valley in 2020. Critics argue that India has been too cautious in its approach to China, often refraining from taking a hardline stance even when its national security interests are at stake. For instance, India's response to China's territorial incursions has been seen as reactive and piecemeal, rather than part of a broader strategic vision. This hesitancy has allowed China to gradually expand its influence in South Asia and the Indian Ocean region, often at India's expense. Moreover, India's reluctance to fully embrace the US and Quad as a counterbalance to China has been viewed as a significant foreign policy failure. By refusing to explicitly align itself with the US-led Indo-Pacific strategy, which seeks to contain China's rise, India has missed an opportunity to strengthen its position as a regional leader and a key player in global geopolitics. This reluctance is often attributed to India's outdated adherence to non-alignment, which critics argue is no longer relevant in the current global order. India's economic diplomacy has been another area of concern. Despite its ambitions to become a global economic powerhouse, India has often failed to build strong trade relationships, particularly with the West. While countries like China have aggressively pursued trade and investment opportunities through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, India has been more cautious and less proactive in expanding its economic influence. For example, India's decision to opt out of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a major trade agreement that includes China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the ASEAN nations, was widely criticized as a strategic blunder. While the Indian government justified the decision on the grounds that the agreement did not adequately protect India's domestic industries, critics argue that India missed a crucial opportunity to integrate itself into the global trading system and counterbalance China's economic influence. Furthermore, India's approach to trade negotiations with the EU and the US has been inconsistent. Despite repeated attempts, India has failed to secure a comprehensive free trade agreement with either the EU or the US, two of the world's largest economic blocs. This failure has limited India's ability to fully capitalize on its growing economic potential and integrate itself into the global economy. Critics argue that India's protectionist tendencies, particularly its reluctance to open up its markets, have hampered its ability to forge strong economic partnerships with key global powers. India's aspirations to become a global leader have also been undermined by its lack of proactive leadership in global governance institutions. Despite its large population, growing economy, and status as a nuclear power, India has often been seen as a passive player in institutions like the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and the G20. While India has called for reforms in these institutions, particularly for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, it has failed to build the necessary coalitions and diplomatic momentum to achieve these goals. India's reluctance to take bold positions on global issues such as climate change, human rights, and global security has further undermined its credibility as a global leader. For example, India's lukewarm commitment to climate change mitigation, despite being one of the world's largest emitters of greenhouse gases, has been criticized by environmental activists and global leaders alike. Similarly, India's reluctance to take strong positions on human rights abuses in countries like Myanmar, Afghanistan, and China has raised questions about its commitment to global norms and values. Critics argue that India's foreign policy establishment has failed to fully appreciate the importance of leadership in global governance. By focusing too much on managing its immediate neighborhood and balancing relations with major powers, India has neglected its responsibility to lead on global issues that require collective action. This failure has prevented India from fully realizing its potential as a global leader and undermined its efforts to secure greater influence in international institutions. A significant factor contributing to the failures and flaws in India's foreign policy has been the influence of domestic politics. India's foreign policy decisions are often driven by short-term political considerations, particularly the need to appeal to domestic constituencies. This has led to a foreign policy that is more reactive than proactive, with decisions often being influenced by domestic political pressures rather than long-term strategic objectives. For instance, India's handling of its relationship with Pakistan is often shaped by domestic political considerations, particularly the need to project a tough stance on terrorism and national security. This has led to an inconsistent approach, with periods of diplomatic engagement being followed by military confrontations and vice versa. Similarly, India's economic policies, particularly its reluctance to open up its markets, are often influenced by domestic protectionist lobbies, which have prevented India from fully integrating into the global economy. The influence of domestic politics is also evident in India's approach to China. Despite the growing threat posed by China's military and economic expansion, India has often refrained from taking a more assertive stance, partly due to concerns about the potential economic fallout from a confrontation with its largest trading partner. This has led to a foreign policy that is often seen as cautious and risk-averse, rather than bold and decisive. In conclusion, the failure of India's foreign policy can be attributed to a combination of strategic ambiguity, inconsistent diplomatic efforts, and the influence of domestic political considerations. India's reluctance to fully commit to either the Western or Eastern Bloc has left it in a geopolitical limbo, weakening its ability to build strong, long-term partnerships and assert itself as a global leader. Its failure to effectively manage its relationships with major powers like China, Russia, and the US, as well as its inability to build stable relationships with its neighbors, has further undermined its foreign policy goals. To address these flaws, India must adopt a more proactive and coherent foreign policy that is guided by clear strategic objectives rather than short-term political considerations. This will require India to move beyond its outdated adherence to non-alignment and take bold positions on key global issues. Furthermore, India must invest in building strong regional relationships and actively participate in global governance institutions if it is to realize its ambitions of becoming a global leader. In an increasingly complex and multipolar world, the need for a clear and decisive foreign policy has never been greater. India must rise to the challenge and redefine its foreign policy for the 20th.